Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address came at one of the tensest, gravest times in American history. It's March 4th, 1861. 7 southern states have left the Union, secession they called it, and they had formed the Confederate States of America. And now the question was, what would happen to the remaining slave states in the Upper South? Lincoln was untested in the eyes of some, and he came to Washington and delivered his inaugural address from the Capitol, and he had to solve this immense problem. Try in one way to be firm, and in another way to be conciliatory. And Lincoln, in this first inaugural address, took a number of ways to try to explain that balance. But he began with a premise that was, in a sense, very rigid. He said there was no doubt in his mind that secession was an impossibility. He said directly, "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, that the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination." This is Lincoln's fundamental premise. The Union is perpetual. Secession is illegal and unconstitutional. He will not bend on that at all. It follows from these views that no state upon its mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances, referring to the resolves and ordinances of the southern states declaring themselves seceded, to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. The previous president had said that secession was also unconstitutional, but he was unwilling to use coercion to stop it. Lincoln here is indicating his willingness to use force to respond to force wherever necessary. Lincoln said, "I therefore consider that in the view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken. Secession doesn't exist legally," he says, in effect. "And to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed. Doing this I deem to be only a simple duty on my part, and I shall perform it so far as is practicable, unless my rightful masters," this is a play on slavery, but it's all about democracy, "unless my rightful masters, the American people, shall withhold the requisite means, or in some authoritative manner direct the contrary. I trust this will not be regarded as menace, but only as a declared purpose of the Union that will constitutionally defend and maintain itself." Lincoln is taking a hard line here, but he is couching it in ways that might make it seem less offensive to Southerners, although we shouldn't fool ourselves. Audiences in 1861 heard these lines as menacing if they believed that the actions of Southern states were justified in the face of a Republican victory in 1860. Lincoln goes on to attack the idea of secession. Plainly, he says, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. For me, as a historian, I find these lines to be central to understanding Lincoln. He believes that the central bulwark of freedom in America is the election process, and these elections are the only true sovereigns of the American people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or despotism. Rejection of the results of the 1860 election, according to Lincoln, are anarchy or despotism. Unanimity is impossible, he says. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form, is all that is left. Now, of course, Southerners saw it differently. As you can imagine, they see the Union as a compact of states. What Lincoln is suggesting here is that it was a compact of people, and that the majority of voters had declared themselves on the issue of slavery's right or wrong and its future in this country. They had not declared themselves in favor of abolition, but they had declared themselves in favor of containment. And Lincoln was being firm on that too. And he says it here. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. That is the only substantial dispute, he says. Physically speaking, he ends in a way that tries to conciliate. We cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. My countrymen, he says, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. He's now addressing everybody. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. He urges restraint. If there can be an object to hurry any of you in hot haste to a step which you would never take deliberately, that object will be frustrated by taking time, but no good object can be frustrated by it. Take time, he's imploring everyone. Such of you are as now dissatisfied, still have the old constitution unimpaired, and on the sensitive point the laws of your own framing under it, while the new administration will have no immediate power, if it would, to change either. If it were admitted that those of you who are dissatisfied hold the right side in the dispute, there is still no single good reason for precipitate action, meaning immediate action. Intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on Him, meaning God, who has never yet forsaken this favored land, are still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty. Lincoln is urging time in order to diffuse the crisis. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you, he says. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. What Lincoln has done here is try to push the moral responsibility of war on the seceding states and those who are advocating for secession. He's framed this debate as one where he is acting to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery, not to harass Southerners, not to act rashly, but rather deliberate, calm preservation of a nation that all of them claim to love. This is a very strong strategic position to take. It's not going to win over supporters in the South, but it is designed to help make it harder for upper South states to secede. Now, Lincoln was planning to end his speech, but William Seward, his Secretary of State, had urged him to close with something even more magnanimous, something that would stoke greater feelings of fraternity. And so he drafted a paragraph that Lincoln rewrote that became the closing of the first inaugural address. And it is almost poetry. Lincoln writes, using some of Seward's words, I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and heartstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. That sentiment was affecting, but it did not determine the results. The reaction to the first inaugural address was all over the board in North and South. There were critics and there were supporters, but it did not stop the rush toward conflict. It wasn't the turning point. The turning point would be the battle over Fort Sumter the next month. It was a sincere effort to try to stave off the crisis, but it was not ultimately an effective one. It did lay out Lincoln's position, which was to define this conflict as one about the preservation of a union, not a union of states, but a union of people, where the rights of those people were battled and determined by elections. That's what Lincoln would determine to be the fundamental and underlying justification for waging this war, to protect government of the people, by the people, for the people.